Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be doing a follow-up to a previous video I did on this channel. In that video, I discussed who the best main villain or antagonist was in Dragon Ball Super. Well, in this video, I'm going to go back to a previous entry in the franchise and take a look at Dragon Ball Z. So who was the best main antagonist in Dragon Ball Z? Well, in this video, I'm going to discuss that. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you can see all of my content right away when it comes out. Alright, so over here, as you can see on my community tab, just like last time, I did a poll in which I asked you guys who the best main antagonist in Dragon Ball Z is. And as you guys can see, Frieza is the one who came out on top in this poll in the popular vote, as it seems that overwhelmingly people went with him being the best main antagonist. However, just like last time, I'm going to go through each of the names, Vegeta, Frieza, Cell, and Buu, and discuss their merits as well as who I believe among them is the best antagonist. So I'm going to start off with Vegeta, the main bad guy or antagonist of the Saiyan saga. And you can argue that perhaps Raditz was really the first main bad guy in the arc, considering that he kicked off Dragon Ball Z, he kicked off the more sci-fi elements of the series, and of course he introduced Goku to the fact that he was a Saiyan and of somewhere other than the Earth. But in this case, I'm just going to go with Vegeta. Now, Vegeta is a character who is perhaps the most dynamic villain who is introduced in all of Dragon Ball thus far. Of course, he first starts out as the Saiyan Prince, the super proud and incredibly powerful Saiyan who comes from a long-dead planet that was destroyed by Frieza, which of course we would learn later on. And upon learning about the Dragon Balls, Vegeta's main goal at first is not to wish back Raditz, but rather to wish for immortality for he and his cohort Nappa. And of course, as we would later find out, this is because of Frieza. And Vegeta is a very interesting villain and really remains a villain arguably up through the Namek saga during the conflict against Frieza, because he is serving as an antagonist to Gohan and Krillin in their search for the Dragon Balls. He goes around wiping out entire villages of Namekians, which obviously is not a heroic trait at all. And he ultimately is a character who is still motivated by his own selfishness, which of course is a theme that carries throughout the Cell saga and of course the Buu saga, but by that point in the story he's more of a unwilling ally, or somebody who is temporarily making a truce with Goku and friends so that they can defeat the current threat so that he can eventually defeat Goku. And I think in terms of character development and in terms of fleshing a villain out, you could really say that Vegeta stands above the rest. But considering that most of this development came after he was the main villain, and then he became more of a side villain and then more of a friendly character and ally as time went along, then you can definitely argue that within his own arc and as the main bad guy, then maybe he isn't truly as iconic or as interesting in some ways as the following people on this list. So coming up next to the next main villain in chronological order, and the person who got 50% on this poll overall would have to be Frieza. And it's kind of hard to really talk about Frieza without mentioning that many people really got into Dragon Ball Z during the time on Namek in which he was the main villain. And certainly during that period of time, Frieza was the most intimidating character who we'd ever come across before. As we saw that Vegeta, Gohan, Krillin, Goku, all these people who are super powerful at this point, more powerful than ever before, are struggling kind of against Frieza's goons, so to speak, against people like the Ginyu Force and his soldiers at points like Zarbon and Dodoria. And then you see how Frieza, in just his weakest form, is so easily handling a character like Nail, who is on the same level as some of the weaker members of the Ginyu Force, and just how this guy basically just sits around while everyone cowers in fear in his very presence, really cemented him as a very intimidating and powerful villain. And of course, as we know, he would show off more and more of that power during his fight against Vegeta, Gohan, and Krillin, as well as Piccolo, who would show up as he progressed progress through each of his forms. Of course, in his second tall, big form, in his next form, which was the xenomorph-looking form that Toriyama was very clearly inspired by aliens when designing that form. And then, of course, his final, smaller, sleeker form, which at first looks a lot less threatening, but then when you really get into it, it's perhaps the scariest form of all, as he's so effortlessly toying with and destroying people such as Vegeta, who had just gotten yet another Zenkai boost. So, in terms of a character who really has such a level above everyone else in the series and perhaps the entire franchise, a character who is so significantly above everyone, and if he just so chose at any point he could blow up the planet, he could wipe out every single one of them. I guess from that perspective, you can argue that Frieza was perhaps the biggest challenge that any of the Z fighters, and Goku included, ever faced throughout the entire franchise, even though characters who came after him were significantly more powerful. The relative danger here is perhaps greater than everything else. However, for me, I feel like Frieza isn't really the most developed villain in terms of his motivations, in terms of like what really makes him tick. Like, sure, we got more development as the series went along, especially in Dragon Ball Super, particularly in the Tournament of Power, but really his motivations come down to, I'm really powerful, I want to be the most powerful, I'm going to control everything and wipe everyone out. You know, he's kind of like Emperor Palpatine, except Palpatine had a little bit more layers to him than Frieza does. So, you know, in terms of being perhaps the most iconic villain, I guess you could argue that Frieza is certainly that, but there's definitely some arguments to be made against Frieza being the best antagonist in Dragon Ball Z, and really the best antagonist in the Dragon Ball franchise, since many people would place him at that level. And one of those big arguments has to come down to the next villain, who many people have considered the perfect Dragon Ball villain, that being Cell, who is definitely one of the most interesting villains in the entire franchise. And not only is it because of his genetic makeup, in which he consists of the cells of Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, Frieza, and King Cold, as well as some others, but really just his entire origin, how he came from the future of another timeline and killed a different future Trunks and traveled back in time, causing the creation of the main timeline, all in an effort to reach his goal of perfection by absorbing the two previous main villains in the arc, or who we thought would be the main villains of the arc, in Android 17 and 18. Android 17 and 18 being these incredibly powerful enemies who ravaged Trunks' timeline and caused him to go back in time to help the main timeline in the first place and seek some kind of way of defeating his own villains. And Cell literally emerges from the ground in this larval form as this really interesting looking kind of cicada creature, or as Harold would call him, the giant cricket man. And really his voice, especially in the English dub from Damian Clark, his moveset, his motivations, the fact that he's actually really intelligent and not just some kind of buffoonish villain who just wants to be super strong because, who has some real goals, and in many ways you can argue Cell really accomplished that goal. Because at the end of the day, Cell's programming and his real goal was to become perfect by absorbing the androids and attaining this perfect ultimate form that no one really stood any chance against at that point, and as an added benefit to defeat Goku, which when it comes down to it, he actually did during their fight, as Goku gave up and Goku stated that he was not able to defeat Cell and only Gohan was able to do that. And really you can argue that the second Cell became perfect, he could have really just destroyed the Earth and pretty much won right there. And the Cell games were more, I guess, kind of something that came as an added benefit just because he wanted an extra challenge. So it's really his own hubris and his own arrogance, much like Vegeta, which led to his downfall, which is also very akin to another villain like Thanos, who always subconsciously allowed himself to be defeated, even when he was more powerful than everyone else around him. And really Cell, with his different forms, with his regeneration, with the fact that he comes back, and with the fact that he kind of served in many ways as a passing of the torch as a villain to the next generation of Gohan, which obviously didn't pan out exactly the way that everyone thought it would. can really solidify him perhaps as being the best villain in Dragon Ball Z, and definitely one of the best in the Dragon Ball franchise. But of course, there is one more main antagonist on this list, and the arc that came after Cell's, not of course including the arc with Pikkon, which isn't on this list because it's entirely filler and wasn't in the manga, even though he's really cool, and that would have to be Majin Buu. And Majin Buu, of course, is another really interesting character because the entire build up to that point in the arc in which Majin Buu is actually resurrected and is revealed to the audience, you have this sense of dread of this unstoppable monster that could be released. Of course, a lot of the people who were enlisted to help in the fight, such as Goku and Vegeta, who basically allow him through their own fight to be resurrected, they don't really believe in his threat. But the second that Buu comes out of that shell and they sense his power when he attacks Deborah, they can automatically tell that they're way in over their heads, and this is something that they never should have allowed to happen. So automatically at the start of this, the very reason why Buu has come into being, again at least, is because of the fact that our heroes allowed it to happen, and they had various opportunities to stop it. Just as we see what happens in Dragon Ball Super with Future Trunks, who also has the opportunity to stop it and actually does so. But once Buu comes out, it's not like he's this big mustache-twirling villain. He's somebody whose goal is to become the strongest there is and defeat everyone and stop Son Goku. That's not really on his mind, because Buu, when he's first resurrected, is a childlike creature. He's somebody who doesn't really know any better than what he's doing, which is eventually expounded upon once Mr. Satan shows up to his house. We find out that Majin Buu destroyed simply because he was told to. He was told to destroy and to kill by Bibbidi and Bobbidi, and of course also given treats as kind of a bribe in order to do it. But once he meets with Mr. Satan, he finds out that killing is a bad thing and swears off of it, which is a really interesting turn for a Dragon Ball villain. But of course, as we know, that was only really the beginning, because this caused a divide in Buu, very much like the Nameless Namekian with Kami and Piccolo, and led to Majin Buu splitting between the good Buu and the evil Buu, who of course won in the end, creating Super Buu. And I like Super Buu when he initially appears. You know, he is kind of this taller, more monstrous version of Buu, who is still kind of mindless. He still isn't very intelligent, but at the same time, he's a lot more malevolent and willing to just destroy everyone and everything, which he pretty much does when he uses the human extinction attack. But after that point, it really starts to go downhill, which the entire Buu saga was doing at that point, because he fights Gotenks and it seems like he's gonna lose, but no, Gotenks loses and Gotenks defuses. And then it seems like he's gonna lose to Ultimate Gohan, but no, he comes up with some crazy ability that comes out of nowhere in absorbing people, which is just like what Cell did in order to become stronger, in order to attain an even more powerful form. So he becomes Buu-Tanks, and then he becomes Buu-Han. And honestly, even though this makes him more of a thinking villain and somebody who can like throw quips at people, in some ways he isn't really as entertaining, and he becomes a little bit more like a generic DBZ villain. However, when all of the components are ripped out of him and he finally reverts back to his true original form in Kid Buu, I think it really picks back up and he becomes a more interesting villain again, because really he's more of a mindless creature and a force of nature at this point. You know, he's more like a ruthless animal, which it kind of comes down to Goku putting him down in the end, which is kind of a melancholy moment. But ultimately, I don't really like Fat Buu as much as a villain as I do like him as a protagonist, and I feel like the best part of Villain Buu is Kid Buu, which we don't really see for that long, but it's pretty cool while he lasts. So for me, I think it makes sense to see him at this position on the poll. So with that being said, there's a decision to be made about who is the best antagonist in Dragon Ball Z. But before I make my decision, I'm going to read your comments down below. And as you can see, the first comment says that he's going to go with Buu personally, despite Frieza being objectively better. I like Buu, and especially Super to Kid Buu, because they are force of nature and you cannot reason with or sympathize with them, and that to him is terrifying, which is definitely a really cool concept that Buu was able to, at some points in his character, bring out better than others. And then next up, Frieza. Frieza made the biggest impact on the entire Dragon Ball world. Through his actions, do we lead to Goku's adventure and battles? Well, I don't really know about that, because Goku was already having some pretty big battles and adventures before he ever even heard about Frieza, or even heard that he was a Saiyan, so not entirely sure I would go at that point, but he's perhaps the biggest impact is true. Vegeta. In terms of fights, I could actually required power and skill Vegeta. I don't even like Vegeta. There's a lot of people in the community who don't like Vegeta, but I'm definitely not among them. Only antagonists the Z fighters actually worked together against and didn't rely on Toriyama recoloring Goku's hair or terrible writing. I mean, they did work together against Frieza, but like you said, Goku's hair was recolored and automatically made him 50 times stronger and saved them a bunch of money on ink, so I'm sure that in that case, a lot of people would agree. So again, Frieza, a lot of good foreshadowing and build-up, and his organization really felt like part of the galaxy. Yeah, he has a lot of shared lore with the characters and with the universe as a whole, and that can really go a long way towards building a great villain. Cell, I love them all, but Cell was different in the sense that he was made from everyone, and his impact didn't really get ruined by multiple comebacks. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Cell, had Frieza not come back to life for the Tournament of Power, I'd put him above Cell. Cell, although he is my favorite, I have no doubt Frieza will win. Well, yeah, Frieza's definitely the most popular, as we could see. Frieza, he was the main bad guy in DBZ, and because of that, Goku reached another level beyond his powers. I mean, you can't say that he was the main bad guy in DBZ just because he is one villain in the show and he's really popular. You know, it's not like Mum Ra where Frieza comes back every single arc or every other episode and they have to keep fighting him and sending him back. I mean, I know the movies kept making it seem that way at some points, but it really wasn't to that degree in the manga. Vegeta, Frieza, Cell, Buu, Frieza. Frieza, because he chooses to be evil and sadistic even after Goku gave him like 4 chances to turn over a new way of life. Frieza still decided to be a dick. I mean, yeah, Frieza is really like that Joker-esque character who, even though Batman beats him down over and over again, he breaks his bones, he puts him in Arkham Asylum, he's still gonna keep doing what he's doing. And someone who voted for Frieza says, I would like to say Cell, but in my understanding, Cell was doing what he was supposed to be doing, what he was built for, which was to absorb Android 17 and 18 and restore the Red Ribbon Army to his former glory. Since the latter one was pretty much gone, he became a regular villain, evil for the sake of being evil. I don't really agree with that, because simply because Cell was programmed to do something doesn't make his accomplishments of doing them any less impactful. At the same time, he wasn't evil for the sake of being evil. His character really developed and his purpose developed after he became perfect. As we saw, it's not like Cell ever said, I'm going to restore the Red Ribbon Army, or I'm going to do what Dr. Gero was planning to do and take over the world and do everything. Cell was probably just going to blow up the Earth once he won the Cell games, and then go around the universe wiping everything else out, much like Majin Buu. And really, you can see a lot of similarities in Majin Buu to Cell, which is another reason why, in my opinion, Buu really can't be the best main villain in Dragon Ball Z, and is arguably the weakest villain, because so much of what he had came from Cell. The regeneration, the absorption, a lot of what he does is kind of rehashed from Cell, although a lot of the different aspects of Buu are really interesting. But overall, as you could see in this poll, Frieza comes out the best main antagonist in Dragon Ball Z through the popular vote. Honestly, he's not my favorite villain in Dragon Ball Z. For me, if I were to pick the best villain, or at least my favorite villain based upon a number of different qualifiers, I would actually say Cell is the best villain. And the reason for that is because, like I said before, Vegeta, even though he's a great villain over the course of the franchise, and he becomes a really interesting character like many of Goku's other allies, such as Piccolo, he wasn't really the best in his own main arc. Frieza is the most iconic villain. He's the one they brought back over and over and over again. I feel like he really isn't as dynamic or as interesting as a character as Cell is. But at the same time, his arc was very revolutionary. It changed how not only Dragon Ball was, but it changed how most anime became after that fact. But at the same time, when we're comparing like different aspects of the character, his motivations, and really who he is, it's hard to really say that he's the best because of the fact that there are things that are holding him back from there. And Cell, even though he's not necessarily like the most human villain or somebody who is the most powerful or even the most relevant at this point in time, and like other people have said in the comments, he wasn't brought back too many times to where he ended up just becoming a complete farce. In his own arc, he defeated the main protagonist and led to the coming of the next protagonist in Gohan. He was really the encompass encompassing of all the previous villains and all the previous heroes in one character. He accomplished his main goal of becoming perfect, and really kind of like Frieza, at any point after that, he could have just destroyed the Earth and won everything there. But much like Frieza, much like Vegeta, he allowed his own arrogance to cloud his judgment. And in the end, when Cell was defeated, it led to the peace of two different timelines. The main timeline in which Perfect Cell was destroyed, and the future timeline in which Trunks defeated him and finally put an end to the android menace forever. So I feel like in terms of his defeat, in terms of his overall arc as a villain, in terms of how he was ultimately done away with, and really the ending point of his character, for me, that's what makes Cell the best main antagonist in Dragon Ball Z. So let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Do you agree with me or disagree? I already know that 50% of people went with Frieza in this poll, so of course a lot of people are bound to disagree, but that's definitely one of the things that makes this franchise so interesting, because you can have so many different opinions on so many different characters. And of course, if you want to vote and comment on this, it's over here in my community tab. And if you're interested, you can go over to my channel Laughingstock Cinema and check out videos like this in which I discussed what if Spider-Man used Ki, and how does the current Disney Star Wars compare to the Star Wars Extended Universe? And there's a lot more videos coming in the future on that channel. And if you like this video, then make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe, enable those damn notifications.